I think it's our third event with Zibby. We had a podcast. I was at a book event in Connecticut for her, and I was so excited to come out to sunny LA to spend time here. And someone's like, "Have you seen the forecast?" But anyway, it was nice to get on a plane. My kids are with my mom, and I get to spend an hour with you guys. So first of all, thank you for coming out in the rain. I would not have blamed you for staying home. So thank you. Um, I guess I'll begin. I don't want to talk too much. I'd love to hear from you and your thoughts and any questions. I guess I'll tell you a little bit about my background and then, how this book came about, because this is my first book. It's a novel for middle grade readers. If you would have asked me 3 years ago that would I'd be doing this, and I probably would have said you're crazy. But here we are. The world has definitely changed. I was born in the former Soviet Union, and I moved to the United States with my parents as political refugees in 1980. So my dad said I was their most expensive luggage that they left with as 18 months old. We were allowed to leave with $180 total. My parents did not want to go where all of the other Soviet refugees were going, which was mostly New York and Los Angeles, and they were quite the contrarians. And my dad was an engineer by training. My mom wanted to go somewhere warm. So HIAS, the Hebrew Resettlement Agency that moved us here, said there's a family and a community in Galveston, Texas that would love to sponsor you. So we moved to Galveston, like fish out of water. My parents had no idea what Galveston was. Houston, they knew because of NASA, and it's a big, internationally recognized city. 6 months later, my dad got a job in Houston. They're still there. And that's where they live. I grew up there, went to school in Houston, went to University of Texas. Never really experienced anti-Semitism growing up. I was definitely an other. I was the only Jewish kid in my school, as we lived in a suburb outside of Houston for the first few years. We were the only Russians in the area. Like all other kids, all you want to do is fit in and blend in, and having a strange name and parents with funny accents and strange food. That was never that was never a perfect reality for me, but it was my own reality, and people embraced it. And once in a blue moon, I would hear something about, oh, Jews killed Jesus, and I'll say, as a child growing up, hi, welcome. What my parents and my friends and I and their parents ended up doing, and none of it was planned. It was just because that was life as it presented itself, and we were the only Jews, and they were the only friends I had, is I would end up going to church with them, and my friends would come to synagogue with me, to Shabbat services. And I can't begin to tell you how much I learned from my friends about their religion, their community. For many of them, I was the first Jew they'd ever met. And so now I look back to those days and think how wholesome that felt. And if only we could do that more and experience each other's cultures a bit more, we'd be in a little bit of a better place. But anyway, fast forward to 2001, I moved to New York. I thought I would be working in finance. I got a job in television, and with no experience, didn't think I wanted to be in television. I was behind the scenes as a producer at CNBC, and then inevitably, 6 or 7 years later, started having some interest in doing on-air work. And then I was at ABC, then Yahoo, CBS, and CNN. And anti-Semitism had always been something that I had learned about, obviously, as a refugee to this country. So grateful to be a Jewish American here, and had heard about my parents' experience in the Soviet Union, where anti-Semitism was, institutionalized there. That was my nationality. As you would know, my birth certificate identifies me as Jewish. My parents, everything from their library card to their driver's license, not that they had a car, but their driver's license, listed them as Jews and identified them as such. There were quotas getting into any good universities. There were limitations in terms of how high up you could go professionally. So all of that was, the culmination of all of that led my parents, thankfully, to be allowed to leave the country as refugees. And so I heard about all these stories, and we all knew about, anti-Semitism being with us for millennia, and sort of morphing from the right, the left, but it was all, in my mind at least, in the past. Yes, once in a while there would be some anti-Semitism, and I think the Tree of Life shooting was the first real wake-up call I had in covering that. Was very personal for me, because it was a right-wing anti-immigrant, shooter who was going after HIAS, which was the organization that helped move us here to the United States. So I remember covering that. And even now looking back, and as personal as that was, I still felt like now I can say all of these cases were almost treated as a one-off, as individual sort of, okay, it's a game of whack-a-mole. Once in a blue moon, some anti-Semitism will pop up. We'll address it, on its own and not view it from a broader scale. And I really had then another wake-up call in 2022, which planted the seed for this book when my son, who was 13 at the time, was very a huge sports fan, and we were on our way to a basketball game, a Brooklyn Nets basketball game, and this is after the Kyrie Irving anti-Semitic posts that garnered international headlines, and that I think followed Kanye West's anti-Semitic post. And what the two had in common, aside from these being two prominent figures, was that despite the offense, there was no real consequence for their action. Everyone but them apologized for these posts. They then had a bunch of support as well for either people defending them or saying it wasn't so bad. And with Kyrie Irving, he eventually was suspended for a few games, but I don't think he ever really fully apologized. And I didn't realize that my son was aware of this at the age of 10, and we were on our way to a basketball game. And he said, "Why are we even going? He doesn't even want me there. Why do they hate us?" It was something along those lines of questions. And I had no idea how to answer him. And so I thought, okay, well, I'm going to email the school tomorrow. Surely they have resources for anti-Semitism because this is after George Floyd's murder. And thankfully, there had been so many resources addressing racism and hate. And, the parents, we were very much engaged with the school. We were constantly being notified about, this new program, these new books, these conversations being held in class. And so I thought, that's great. We're really moving in the right direction as a country. We're really addressing issues that, hadn't been discussed, at least appropriately for so many years. And I just naively thought anti-Semitism fell in that pool as well. And the response from the school was, we actually don't have anything on anti-Semitism. And for Jake's age group, my son, we basically wait for them to ask the questions. And once they do, maybe we'll discuss it. And I'm just thinking, how realistic is it for a 10-year-old to raise their hand in class and ask about anti-Semitism? So that really bothered me, and the seed was planted about needing to fill some sort of void there. But again, the game of whack-a-mole continued, didn't think it was that big of a deal. And then October 7th happened, and the world just turned upside down. And Yonit is a very good friend of mine. We have known each other for many, many years. She's the most prominent news anchor and journalist in Israel for Channel 12. And she had spent her formative years in the United States. She went to elementary school here, so she knows the U.S. very well and the school system too. And after October 7th, I reached out to her because, I needed to know what was happening in Israel and how she was covering the events and the attack. And then she actually went back and found our first correspondence about the book, and it was October 20th when I said to her, I think we're going to have a huge spike in anti-Semitism. And I've been wanting to do something about this. I didn't know how to go about it, but I think you and I should write a book together and fill the void and write the book we can't find for this age group. So we started writing, and then again, she's 5,000 miles away in Israel. She's 7 hours ahead. Neither of us have written a book before, so okay, this is quite an ambitious task. How are we going to do it? And the plot for the book, came together quite quickly. Obviously, the book is about three characters, three protagonists: a 13-year-old brother, his 11-year-old sister, and a 13-year-old ally and friend who's not Jewish. Annie and Theo, the 13-year-old and the 11-year-old, are Jewish. They live in Chicago. They have Israeli grandparents who are great characters in this book, and we sort of thought the book was initially going to be more about the grandparents and the kids. Right? No, this is a kid's book. Let's make them the main characters. And so the idea of a prominent sports star saying something anti-Semitic, you now know the backstory there. We my son plays soccer. Soccer is a universal sport. We figured this book, can be viewed and read and understood around the world. So we decided to have a star soccer player make an anti-Semitic slur that's caught on tape. The 13-year-old protagonist, Theo, is a huge soccer fan, and this is his favorite player. And so you see everything spiral after the fact. And soon enough, swastika is painted on his school gym locker. He's a soccer player and a co-captain of the school soccer team. And this book was never intended to be for anti-Semites. So like the Nick Fuenteses of the world, like no one's minds are going to be changed there. But it was more, and no one condemned all the adults in this book. There's no real villain. The soccer player doesn't have a huge role here. He just starts off the book. But the core of it is when the adults don't step up the way they should and address and acknowledge and react to anti-Semitic posts and the swastika and comments made here or there, that allows anti-Semitism to feed and grow and fester. And then the burden falls on the kids. And that's how we decided to lay this book out. A lot of it, it's fictional, but a lot of it is based on real life examples of events that happen in my family and friends and colleagues that have over the years experienced anti-Semitism too with their kids. So we had laid out the plot pretty early. And by the end of 2023, December, we had the pitch for the book. We had the first few chapters written. I'm lucky to be represented by a major talent agency. They have in-house book agents. So we sent it out to all the major publishing houses. And I have to say, we were surprised that after a few months of not hearing anything, very little feedback, that continued. So we initially were told, okay, well, this is a very difficult age group to write for, which is true. We've come to find out, which is a separate problem because it's a very inquisitive, very smart, curious, impressionable age group that still talks to their parents. And there are no real materials that fit that level of intellect there. So I think that's a loss for this age group that really needs to be addressed too. But then we were told, now may not be the time to write about anti-Semitism. Like there's just, I don't think people want to read books about this now. And then you've got the war going on. So maybe in a couple of years, and we're thinking, now is the time. And then other publishers just never got back to us. So we were so invested in this project, we just said, what, we're gonna self-publish if need be. And then for this year, in February of this year, I ended up, and at this point I lost all humility and I could care less. And anybody that would listen, I would tell them about this book and how I can't find a publisher. And I was sitting at a dinner party, seated one night next to Michael Linton, who used to run Sony Pictures and now is the chairman of Snap. And I was telling him about this book, and I thought, okay, he's going to say, oh, that's so sad. Sorry to hear that. And he said, I'll publish it. And he has a small publishing company that he runs with his sister. It's a regional children's book company. They've never written anything like this, published anything like this. And he said, send me the book. If I like it, we'll publish it. And that was in February or March. Long story short, he liked it. By May, we already had a deal. We were done with the book in July. And the best thing about having a small publisher is that instead of waiting a year and a half and leaving it up to a major publisher to decide when to put this book out, they said, it's up to you. And we said, we need to do it as soon as possible. So November 11th, we published the book. I have to say it sold out on Amazon. I knew that there was a need for it. And I knew just from hearing anecdotally from others about what's happening in their schools across the country and around the world that they don't have books like this. And it's not a panacea, but at least it's one resource. And it's a book that kids can pick up because it's a good story, but also because it addresses maybe some experiences they're going through and haven't discussed. And it's also for their non-Jewish friends and allies who don't know what anti-Semitism looks like or feels like. So I have been blown away by some of the feedback we've already heard from different religious institutions, synagogues across the country, schools, public, private, parents. And sort of, the last thing I'll say before, if you have any questions is, Yonit and I, we've never done this before. We're used to speaking publicly, so that wasn't an issue, but we didn't know who do we bring to our events? Is it kids? Is it parents? Is it faculty, teachers? So we just decided to make it a mix of everyone. And we had an event at the Stryker Center on Tuesday that I was telling you guys about, and we had Gary Kasparov was a speaker, and then Elon Gold was, sort of the comedic relief. And then at the end, we said, let's take some questions. And there were some kids in the audience. And there may be a few hundred people there. And an 8th grader, mind you, in New York City in 2025, an 8th grader raised his hand and said, there is a swastika carved on my desk with Heil Hitler written next to it. And it makes me really sad. And so you could hear a pin drop in the room, and parents' heads were turning around. No one knew what to say, and I just said, thank you so much for speaking, and that's so brave of you. And I hope that you are talking to members of your faculty at your school and the head of this. It's not acceptable. And his mom reached out to me the next day and said, we've been dealing with this problem, privately. The school is aware. We're working on it, but this was the first time he's felt courageous enough and comfortable enough to talk about this in a public setting. And I thought, this is what we need to be doing. We need to be speaking. We did in New York. We went to a school, and kids' hands. I mean, at the end, the teachers were like, that's enough. We're done. And I'm like, no, I think other kids want to say something. And the questions they had, how do you see anti-Semitism? What do you do if you see it? What do you tell someone when they're experiencing it? I mean, it's clear there's a need for these types of conversations. Yonit and I are not the expert, we're not child psychologists. We're not educated on how to combat anti-Semitism per se, but we're hoping this can be a useful tool. And we're working with the ADL about having some sort of supplementals, perhaps, that can go along with guides for teachers to talk to their kids about it. But it's going to be an uphill battle, but it's clear that there's a need for it. So it's a good story. I think it's for kids, for parents, for teachers, for Jews and non-Jews, but it's just to elevate the conversation and the alarm in the country beyond just, this was a one-off incident and let's just move on and not talk about it anymore, because then the burden falls on the kids. And that was what we wanted to sort of, have the crux as a story here. The kids are solving the problems here, but also kids are the ones that have a really good gut instinct, and they know right away when something's right and wrong. And when they don't see the adults around them reacting the same accordingly, then I think things start to spiral, and actions and behavior that we see in this book and in real life become somewhat acceptable and normalized. And then the only thing I'll add is that we decided to set the book in 2022 because we didn't want to have to. We know, I think one of the reasons why teachers in schools have avoided this subject even before October 7th is because they always think now we're going to be drawn into the Middle East and to the conflict there. And then there's so much, emotion surrounding this and so many different views, and we don't want to get mired in that. I will say, as great as this country is, and I couldn't imagine living in any other country, especially coming as an immigrant. It's a choice my parents made, and so I'm forever grateful to be here. But I don't remember a day growing up as a kid in Texas or even here now and seeing my kids where there isn't an armed guard outside of a Jewish house of worship or institution. And we've also sort of normalized that in this country. And to the point where I don't feel comfortable going into a temple or a JCC or any major place of worship where there isn't security. So that's also one of those acts that I think we tend to, again, nobody says anti-Semitism is good, but the fact that we've sort of accepted this as a norm is a problem too. So there's sort of I hope I've talked enough, or you get a sense of what the book is about and who it's for. But I'm grateful that you all came, so I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. If anyone wants to be the first, or any
I'll be the
or
first.
comments,
I mean,
yeah.
I'm very grateful and appreciative for this. I mean, our kids, have not, fortunately, haven't experienced any of this type of thing firsthand. You grew up in, how old were you when you,
I was 18 months old and then grew up outside of Houston.
Okay, so you didn't actually experience any anti-Semitism in the Soviet
No.
Union. You were too young.
No, yeah.
I just, this is a kind of a chink in the armor, so to speak, of the floodgates that are open. So there's it feels sort of like it's coming from all directions right now.
Yeah.
what do you see sort of down the line? I mean, you're meeting with people, you're speaking in front of people, you're speaking in front of young people. They're not all Jewish kids, right?
No.
So the ones that are in college are indoctrinated very much with,
Yeah.
certain points of view. Um, Addressing this market, I think, is essential because they're not yet in college, but they're being influenced by a lot of things. So what do you sort of seek coming down the pike, and being in the news industry as well?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons we wanted to write a book for this age group, because not only did we see that there were no books like this, but as you said, this is such an impressionable group and they're so well informed. Even if they're not on social media yet, they see what's happening. You can't protect them and shield them from everything. I mean, my kid is like a case study in this. He doesn't have social media, but he reads everything. And this is also sort of one generation before removed from what we've seen on college campuses. And I think a big disservice has been done over the years in trying to, it's not fashionable anymore, but maybe that's changing quickly too, to just come out and say you're an anti-Semite. I was shocked that all of a sudden, so quickly, Zionism became such a polarizing word. When I grew up, Israel sort of superseded politics. It didn't matter which party was in office, right, left, good prime minister, bad prime minister, corruption, non-corruption. I mean, it was the country as a whole that stood as the ancestral homeland of Jewish people. And from the diaspora, anyone was welcome. You could come. I mean, and that's how I viewed and learned to respect and loved Israel. And I spent a few weeks there as a kid over, very formative years during a summer period. And I think there's a generational change now that we're seeing, even among Jewish kids here in this country, where they don't feel necessarily as Jews in America that there's any connection to Israel and that you can separate the two. And for me, and I think still the majority of Jews, anybody who calls themselves anti-Zionist, that just comes across as anti-Semitic, and it's hard to square the two. And it's probably cleaner to say you're anti-Zionist, but no, I love Jews, and I don't even know what that means. So that was one of the reasons. Again, this doesn't take place in post in October 7th world, and doesn't touch on the conflict, but it was important to have an Israeli co-author, just to reiterate that point. That
But it's kind of telling, interestingly, that you had to kind of consciously make that decision.
Yes.
I don't want to get stuck in the whole, kind of geopolitical situation. So therefore, we have to set it before the story.
Because anti-Semitism, as we know, existed long before the state of Israel. And for this age group, I feel like you need more than a 250-page book to go into the history of the conflict there. As a journalist, I will say, and I'm not a naive person, and even in covering, previous wars and fighting in the Middle East, nothing has been this long, nothing has been this brutal and ugly. And wars are just that. And the longer they go on, the uglier they are. And inevitably, I am by no means a spokesperson for the Israeli government, and I am not one to say this was a wrong action, that was a right action. But it did get to the point where I just felt this was wall-to-wall coverage. It even exceeded, coverage of the war in Ukraine. And this was the one conflict that I think generated so much emotion, even among my colleagues. And I'm grateful at CNN, we have tons of real estate. I have my own show. I was able to spend a lot of time covering the hostages and going to Israel and talking about that trauma and reminding people of how this war began. And, the assault against women in particular and the violence there. But again, looking back now, there's this sort of revisionist history that all of this came about only after the war became bloodier and bloodier. And again, October 20th, I don't even know if the IDF had gone in yet when I already texted Yonit and said, we're going to have a problem and let's write a book. I was on air on CNN on a panel right around this time too, talking about New Yorkers being afraid of getting into Ubers because of their last names, taking mezuzahs off their doors. College students, the protests had already started. That this didn't happen in a vacuum, justification had already begun. So none of this is to say that some actions by the current government in Israel have helped, but I also felt like all of a sudden this became a purity test. Okay, you're a good Jew if you can condemn X, Y, and Z. And I just felt that that wasn't the case for any other conflict. As much as, we talk about other wars, or maybe we don't talk enough about, you look at our adversaries, and nobody today is saying, well, should North Korea be a country? I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Should China be a country? Is it a legitimate? I'm not, should Russia be a legitimate country? I'm not, and so there was only one country that was applied to. And that became an issue. And I think for kids, even if at school, they don't necessarily think what they're saying is anti-Semitic, but maybe I'm just going to go criticize Israel. They don't necessarily understand that for the majority of Jews and maybe their peers, they feel like they're criticizing them as Jews too. So we thought, okay, let's break the ice. Some uncomfortable conversations are meant to be had. And this was at least one way to get that started in schools. Yes.
First of all, your coverage I thought was incredible.
Thank you.
And I'm very, very grateful. It stood out amongst like all of your colleagues.
Thank you.
Truly, in all news outlets. So thank you for that. I created a Jewish teen leadership program. So it's for post-b'nai mitzvah students. And something that really fascinates me is kind of the intersection about media illiteracy among students at a time when like all of their news consumption is pretty much done in social media. And then I appreciate that your book, it had some very dramatic, having a swastika and having certain things that people say, that's very explicit anti-Semitism. But I think the implicit anti-Semitism is much harder to identify. And that's what you were just, I think, referring to in just the dialogue about Israel. And so I think that's really challenging for the students, because to piggyback on your point, anti-Semitism seems like the one type of hate that's attributed towards a minority group, where not only do they not necessarily believe Jews are qualified to point out what's anti-Semitic, but often they'll say enough about this, like sort of the point, like it's too much for me here. And so hearing my students say that they feel intimidated to even bring out to a friend that's something they're saying is anti-Semitic, because they don't want their friend to say, oh, you're so touchy.
Oh, here we go again. Right. Yes.
You're always complaining. We were just talking about Israel, like it's a bit too much. And that's an interesting dynamic when it's a friend, when it's not a celebrity, when it's not someone else in there. And so I am wondering, to the extent that you're hearing from students, like, how do we empower them?
I mean, even that boy, the 8th grader, who, for the first time in a public crowd said, I have, a swastika carved on my desk. I mean, these are stories you would have expected to hear, decades ago, centuries ago, and not even in America. And I felt, even with the Kanye West and the Kyrie Irving, and these are just, prominent figures. I mean, this is, I think, a study that could be had about, other instances across the country that people were going through, where even with the Kyrie, it did feel like at some point, like, okay, let's just stop being a burden. Okay, move on. It's like they're going to lose the series. Look at their standing now. He's their best player. You really want to do this? It's only going to increase anti-Semitism. That's another thing we hear. Well, that's only going to make anti-Semitism worse. Then other athletes would come to their defense. He didn't really mean it. I don't see the harm. He's a good guy. And then the burden's put on the victim. And it's like, okay, well, I don't mean to cause ruckus, or I don't mean to to be somebody who's standing in the way of X, Y, and Z. And there are scenes like that in the book too. And again, they reflect on experiences members of my family had. There's a principal in the book who, this boy, Theo, musters the courage to actually go and talk to him, because at first he doesn't want to acknowledge that was his locker and doesn't want to make a big fuss over it, because their soccer team is about to go to the championship. And if the principal reports the swastika, then they may be disqualified. And all these paperwork have to be filed. And so the principal is telling him, well, you're a good player. You're a great player. You have such a great reputation. You do realize, first of all, if we do this, I mean, I will do it, but there's a lot of paperwork. The whole team may be punished. Is this really what you want? And I feel like examples like that happen in real life. We had my stepson at a school in Washington, D.C. in 2017. had multiple instances of swastikas found in markings throughout the school. And after the first and then second time, we just felt like the notes that the school was sending home about it was like a tertiary issue. Like, there was a rat found in the school, this, whatever, but the bus was late. And then, by the way, swastikas. And so after the second one, and we could see it really bothered my son, my husband reached out to the school and said, listen, this is a serious matter. This is the second time you've had swastikas spray painted on the school walls. Like, what are you doing about it? Because it's clearly not aggressive enough. And the head of the school wrote back and said, well, Peter, I'm really shocked by your tone. First of all, one swastika was not spray painted. It was in pencil, and the other was on a dry erase board. So basically, like, we cleaned it up. Erased the pencil swastika and erased the dry erase board swastika, and nothing to see here. And it's because of that I just feel people have felt either uncomfortable to speak out because they don't want to be the problem, and it's been allowed to grow and metastasize and be somewhat acceptable to where very educated leaders of top universities in this country are saying, well, context matters, the First Amendment. And then you're really thinking to yourself, I'm being gaslit, because if this were any other minority, that would never be their justification. They wouldn't be, using these legalese arguments in defense of not doing more. And there were times, even as a Jew myself, where I just felt like I feel like this is anti-Semitism, and I'm being told it's not. Or I'm being, oh no, there are 2 Jewish students over there, so that's not anti-Semitic. And again, you're telling me how I'm supposed to be feeling, or how I'm feeling is wrong. So I'm thinking, if I'm a 47-year-old journalist who should know better, how are 10-year-old and 12-year-old kids dealing with this at school? And again, it was also one of these things where teachers and schools, I know in our case, and I know throughout the country, because this was such, a tense topic, we're told that they just couldn't talk about the war. And yet there would be little comments here or there that would suggest, well, hey, I think this person thinks this way about the war, or I think this person thinks this way. Or, I had my son say, his friends were asking, what do you think the prime minister's bad guy, good guy? And just, again, going back to these purity tests where it's, I don't like the government, but I still think Israel's right to exist. And that doesn't apply to any other situations. And all of a sudden, our kids are sort of expected to be geopolitical experts. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's I think, pervasive. Anything? Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I'm curious to hear more too, and if you feel, because it, obviously in the setting that you place it is so important, and I hear so many anecdotal, same things happening all over, but then also your journey to get it published, and sort of the silence and the conspiracy of silence, and sort of, I feel like culturally there's a lot, and it's also here in LA, which I have definitely a lot of stories of that too, where it's this, I guess that idea that maybe it's not an issue that needs to be addressed, even in a larger cultural, artistic, creative sense. And I wonder kind of if you can speak a little bit more about that. If you felt that sort of played a part in it, where it's the idea that, well, Jewish stories aren't, no one wants to read them, or whatever the excuses are, or it's too, specific or small.
Yeah.
There's always some excuse why Jewish stories don't sort of push forward or have the same attention.
Yeah, there were sort of we found there were the palatable and acceptable Jewish stories. So kindergartners had tons of books on Hanukkah. High schoolers, were given options to read, more in depth about the Holocaust. And then there was nothing in this age group, and there was nothing on the issue of anti-Semitism as a whole. And I have to say, my great publicist is here too as well. And it was meant to be even meeting, because we were meeting at an event. We met at an event on anti-Semitism in New York. And as she was even trying to pitch this book to other outlets and major publications, they would say, we're going to pass. We're not going to talk about this, or in their parenting publications too. And so Hillary said, she went online to look at, okay, well, what are their other works, or what have they printed and published and promoted about anti-Semitism. And the only thing she found was how to talk to your kids about Christmas envy. And these are just such superficial topics. And it just goes to show that there was a real void and I think deliberate avoidance of dealing with this. And I finally, speaking out, I'll be the first to say the media has gotten a lot of things wrong, and we should acknowledge that. And we try to course correct and get things right all the time. I mean, we're not perfect, and we learn from our mistakes. And I think, CNN, whatever people may think of it, I think has done a lot better than some of our other competitors on trying to at least be balanced and telling stories. And I work with some, fearless colleagues as well. But after I've been speaking about this issue and being invited to speak at a number of Jewish organizations, and this is, as I was writing the book, and constantly asked about, well, why is the media doing this? And it's the media's fault, and it's the coverage, and X, Y, and Z. And I finally said, well, let me tell you a story. I'm trying to write a book on anti-Semitism, and I can't find one publisher to publish my book. And, all of you, so it's not just the media. There are other industries that are to blame here and are complicit for their silence. And then people who were there at certain events would come up to me and say, oh, my daughter works at this publishing house, or I know the head of this place. Here, call them. They will fix it. And, they didn't fix it. So I think it's a bigger issue than we've acknowledged. And I think for all the reasons that have been discussed here already.
Do you think that might have something to do with all those hundreds of authors that have signed that BDS?
I mean, this was even before that.
Oh, that was before.
This was even before. I mean, remember, we submitted this book in December of 23. So the war had started. Again, wars are never, pretty, but this was before all of the headlines, before this became sort of a wall-to-wall, before the genocide calls and all. So this was in December when we were told that there's not a market for this book. Or this type of book and for this genre. So we just thought, okay, there's definitely a dearth of material for this genre. Like, people need to write more smart books for kids this age, because they get it and they understand what's happening in the world. And then on top of that, a subject that no one's really touching upon, but almost every kid, Jewish and non-Jewish, has experienced or has heard about. When we were in this, and again, it's New York, but still we went to a school and I would say half of the audience wasn't Jewish. And when I asked how many of you guys know what anti-Semitism is, or have heard it, or heard somebody that experienced it, every hand went up. So it's definitely, I think there's a desire from students to talk about this as well. It's like it's being almost intentionally avoided. And that doesn't end well when you don't talk about an elephant in the room at that point.
Do you think there's going to be a resistance from educators? I mean, I guess you talked a little bit before about the idea of it's so intertwined now with Israel.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any way to even separate those two issues? I did a stupid thing where I looked at the comments on Goodreads for Elie Wiesel's Night, and I wanted to see what the 1-star, and the first one that came up was, I was an educator and I won't teach this anymore because Elie Wiesel never spoke out about the genocide that Israel's perpetrating. And I'm like, what? It was really, I shouldn't have done that, but I
No, well, I mean, we all go down these rabbit holes. The minute I open my phone and it's so sad because Twitter used to be my go-to site when I'd wake up first thing in the morning, because I would curate it and follow, trusted news sites, colleagues, and would be able in 2 minutes to at least get a sense of what's happened overnight in the world. And then, as the morning progresses, then I read more in depth in the newspapers themselves. But it was much more of a trusted site at that point. And now you open it and it's just like this black hole. It's a sewer. And I know the algorithms play a role as well, but, and it's meant to incite you. But the amount of anti-Semitism on that site is just insane. And from the right and from the left. And, I know kids have reacted in all types of ways to October 7th and the increase in anti-Semitism. And for my son, I'll say anecdotally, who was sort of, he was Jewish, like he knew he was Jewish. We went to synagogue from time to time. We were Reform. And after October 7th, he became very, very much engaged in the subject matter, his own heritage. He wanted to be bar mitzvahed in Israel. We went in March for his bar mitzvah, and he became very conservative in his politics. I mean, and it wasn't for many. My husband worked, in the Obama administration years ago, and he's technically still a Democrat. I'm, independent, and so he on his own became very right wing. And on this one issue, he was like a single issue voter at the age of 12 and 13. And so he kept saying, well, listen, you know, the right isn't as anti-Semitic as the left, because he would view all of their comments and criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic. Not all of them are, but it did seem like a lot of it was. And now he's in a really sensitive place where I think he's very confused to see now the people he was following on the right, all of a sudden he's getting anti-Semitism from some of these people that he, you know, was listening to, or they're becoming very defensive within their own party about fighting against anti-Semitism. And so he said, well, there's still like, there's still fewer than on the left, right? And you're thinking, this is how we're raising our kids, to find a party that has the least amount of self-described anti-Semites. So I don't know how this ends. I'd like to think that still doesn't reflect on the country as a whole. What we're seeing on social media, it's just like the extremes. But educators play a huge role. What's happening on college campuses plays a huge role. I think a lot of this has been building up for decades. You know, some of these protests and things that we saw were pretty well organized. October 8th, 9th, 10th, right. And so I think, you know, going back, there was probably a lot happening under our noses that we just weren't paying attention to. And I don't know how to fix it other than talking about it. And, you know, books matter. Like, we're in a bookstore that carries, you know, a lot of, if people want history, they know where to go. And, you know, TikTok and social media is not the solution. No. No. And they can now tailor which books they want to read. You know, the fact that there are people who are trying to rehabilitate Hitler and Stalin, and, you know, now Churchill was the culprit for World War II. And it's all happened. So it's coming at us so quickly. And I think it speaks to a lack of leadership in general for not addressing this head on. And, you know, what we're saying in this book, the teachers and the principals aren't doing, I think in reality, our leaders are failing to do.
You know, the constant stream of information that we didn't experience 10 or 15 years ago, just constantly has created I don't know if it's an alternate reality, but it's created a reality. And so I sometimes wonder, is the reality that exists in pixels and that seems, you know, just constant, never ending, and just dark, really, to be honest, coming from all directions, you said, do we yet know how that aligns or matches up with the non-pixel reality? Like you mentioned, we don't know, like, what does the average American person feel? What do people feel if you get them into a room and have a conversation with them? What we know is that when people are on their phone, alone in a room, they'll say the most horrible things.
Yeah.
So, being in the media, do you have like any sense of what is real versus what is pixel real?
I mean, we try our best to get out of, you know, our bubbles, whether it's New York, Washington, go out to the country, you know, and talk to people. I think polling, however much it's still, you know, accurate, really matters too, because at its core, that's the only way you can aggregate a country's mood and temperature. You know, some of the things we're talking about on a day-to-day basis, or, you know, whatever a president may be tweeting or posting or what have you, I think most people in the country are busy with their own lives and don't pay attention to it. But I still think they turn to the media. And even for older generations, Facebook for a long time was the number one news site, right, for older demographics. You're seeing our numbers completely plummet for network news and for even cable news, and the cord cutting is real. We're now competing where everyone is a journalist in the sense that they all have phones. And it's helpful and useful for us on the one hand when somebody's in a country and something's just happened and we're seeing things in real life, in real time posted, but we still need a fact check. And is this something that, you know, people posted because they wanted to make a political point, or is this what's happening? Or sometimes you'll look at, you know, instances of war or a terror attack and only come to find out completely different country, 5-year-old video. So, you know, we're fortunate to be able to have the resources to still fact check. And, you know, it's not about getting there first, but getting it right. Even early in the war in Gaza, you remember what happened with the hospital, and Biden had to cancel his trip, and it looked like there could be, major uproar throughout the region. And so, things are happening real time, real quickly. Given social media and the speed with which news spreads, it makes our jobs that much more important, but that much harder too, because you're losing an audience, and they're getting their information from social media. And I think some of the standards that we're held to as journalists are not the case for social media.
Sure.
If we posted some of the garbage that is on people's phones, we'd be sued, and rightly so. And a lot of these companies get away with it. And TikTok is a big problem.
Do your parents, with their background, having lived in the Soviet Union, see an element of, propaganda or foreign propaganda? Because I have read that there is some analogy to the way propaganda was created and spread behind in the Soviet
For
Union.
sure. I mean, even now, I told you Gary Kasparov was at this event on Tuesday, and he, he's a staunch Putin critic, but we were talking about the war, and I've gotten to know him through covering the war in Ukraine as well. And he made an important point, because Russia has been able to continue to fund this war. It's been, completely in a wartime footing now. And, inflation's gone through the roof. I mean, this can only last for them for a few more years at this pace, but he's 100% invested in this war. It's existential to him at this point. And they've cut the budget in every single every single sphere, industry, sector, except for propaganda. That is the only part that he's kept. I think he's increased the budget, because he knows that he's still got to tell his people why this war is justifiable and why it's worth fighting. And, at a time when trust in major U.S. institutions, if not all of them, have been eroding, journalism included, what I really worry about is that journalism will be chipped and chipped and chipped away until it's not as relevant, and it's only after the fact that we'll realize how important it is. So.
We have time for one more question.
I appreciate you all coming. I hope you like the book. This is, this is the most important professional thing I've done. It's changed me as a person. Learning a lot from kids. I was the most nervous about what my kids would think of this book, and they actually enjoyed it. And it's not meant to be a didactic book. It's meant to be an entertaining read for kids, and something that I think perhaps consciously, subconsciously, they'll be able to grasp. This is something that I will remember if I see it again. And chances are they'll see things like this. And it's just empathy. It goes a long way. It really does. And so I hope that those are some of the takeaways people have from the book. Thank you so much. Thank you. Well, thank you for having me.
It was lovely. We have more of her books here and up the register for sale. If you haven't gotten it, I'm sure she'd be happy to sign.
Yes.
And maybe take some photos. And thank you again.
Thank you.
coming
Thanks for
out
coming in
and
this
all the time.
weather.
Yeah. Thank
I
you.
really appreciate it.